LoreWarrior Campaign, 4th Succession War, NAIS Volume 2, The Lull. In early 3029, the armed forces of the Federated Sons, or the AFS, had a right to be proud. Davian troops had achieved most of their objectives, seizing large chunks of the Tikhonov and Sarna commonalities of the Capellan Confederation, and destroying half of the Confederation's mech regiments. Lao forces were far too weak to mount any effective counterattacks. On the Steiner Kurita front, Lyran units were coming down from the euphoria of early success. Higher casualties and slower gains had brought them back to reality. The Combine's probing attacks reminded the Lyrans that they could lose what they'd gained, and so the Commonwealth fortified and prepared its defences. Meanwhile, the Kurita forces were recovering from their initial shock and had begun to prepare their revenge. In particular, Coordinator Takashi Kurita wanted vengeance against Wolf's Dragoons, whom he believed had both insulted and injured the Draconis Combine. The lull was a godsend for the rear echelon. The logistical commands of all of the warring realms hurried to take profit from the respite by resupplying and rearming their regiments, as well as reorganizing overextended supply lines. Jump ships evacuated the backlog of survivors from regional hospitals near the front to better facilities closer to home. Comstar officials mediated the repatriation of the remains of many soldiers killed behind enemy lines, and replacements shuttled to the front to bolster exhausted and depleted units. Public reaction. From the beginning of the lull, the leaders of the warring states warned their citizens that the fighting was likely to resume at any moment. Many people, myself included, believed that our leaders were merely being cautious and that the militaries were too exhausted for new battles. Even in the Capellan Confederation and the Draconis Combine, where the news media was virtually an organ of the government, hints about the lull and a possible peace reached the public. One of the many rumours circulating among the people was that Comstar was secretly negotiating peace. Of all the gossip, this seemed to have had the most credence with the people, especially when presenters began dropping vague hints to that effect about their travels and activities. On many worlds, people actually began to celebrate the end of war because of the enigmatic Comstar statements. Meanwhile, people on worlds captured by the Federated Sons and Lyran Commonwealth were allowed to relocate elsewhere in their native realm. With the war apparently over, many did move, especially civil servants and others closely connected to the political structure. Not everyone believed the end was in sight, however, for there was another significant movement of people in the other direction, and these people, including many tradesmen and professionals, fled border worlds for the interior before a new round of fighting. Economic effects. Civilians were eager for peace because they had suffered almost as much as soldiers in the field. All 5 ruling families, even the Marek government of the Free Worlds League, which had participated least in the conflict, had passed austerity measures in order to concentrate on military production, leaving little for the civilian market. The economy of the Federated Sons was the hardest hit. Prince Hansa Davian had been preparing for the war for 3 years. He'd been slowly, almost imperceptibly shifting his production from luxury goods and services toward weapons and materiel. When the war began, shortages appeared quickly in some sectors of the economy, particularly the building industry. In the first few months of the war, it was almost impossible for anyone but the government to obtain medical supplies, construction materials, machinery, and technical equipment. The Davian government established regional warehouse worlds for parceling out these scarce supplies and equipment in emergencies, but officials could do little to alleviate the shock to the population when their shops became near empty of goods. In the Federated Sons, food grew scarce only a few months after the war started. Even on industrialized worlds that were self-sufficient in production, people began to hoard, and this had a run on markets with a snowball effect, even though officials had tried to restore order. Those worlds that did need to import food suffered because the AFS had commandeered so many of the realm's commercial jump ships. On some worlds, crops lay rotting in fields and whole aquaculture centres went stagnant because there was no way to transport the food to markets. On the 3rd of November 3028, Prince Hansa Davian announced a rationing system designed to ensure that everyone in the Federated Sons had enough food, power and clothing to survive. The issuance of ration books, which immediately became known as Davian debt books, suddenly dashed everyone's hopes for peace. and though the public still supported the war, the enthusiasm that had greeted the early successes had begun to dim. The Lyran economy underwent a similar shift during the years just before the war, but the change wasn't as dramatic. The Commonwealth was a much wealthier state, with many more commercial jump ships, and so there were fewer shortages and no rationing except for fuel. The war had less effect on the economy of the Draconis Combine, a realm that was already characterized by an austerity standard. Only in the Combine worlds along the Lyran border were there major food and material shortages because the war had stopped trade with the Lyran Commonwealth. Indeed, the war devastated Lyran traders who worked the Combine border. Most of the Commonwealth economy and people adjusted readily to the sudden halt in import and export, but those who earned their living transporting exports were incensed. After some traders threatened to break the embargo against the Combine, the Steiner government announced that it would immediately confiscate any trading ships that did so. The Lyran merchants, particularly members of the Lyran Free Trade Association, continued to protest. By late February of 3029, the LFTA won the support of the Lyran Teamsters, a major Commonwealth labour union, and when the two began a series of work stoppages on civilian industries, Archon Katrina Steiner got help in dealing with the problem from an unexpected source. The Tikhonov Free Republic was formed in early March and was eager for Lyran trade. With the sudden availability of a new market as profitable as the one it had lost, the LFTA quickly dropped its protest and now rushed to take advantage of this new situation. As for the Capellans, they'd lost a quarter of their territory, including much of their industry, and now the Capellan economy was gasping. In a struggle for sheer survival, Chancellor Lau could afford to concentrate only on military concerns. All transport was consumed by the army, and civilians were taken from their regular jobs to help build fortifications. The supply of consumer goods dried up completely, while even weapon producers began to have difficulty obtaining raw materials because so many of their sources were in Davian hands. Other firms suffered because of the lack of transport-made deliveries, and this was difficult and unpredictable in the sector. Perhaps worst of all, Earthworks Limited and its subsidiary Calon Industries, two of the Capellan mech producers, were in Davian hands and now producing weapons for the enemy. As bleak as was the military outlook for the Chancellor, daily life was worse. Many people were starving, though the Chancellor seemed oblivious to this fact. Though patriotism undoubtedly inspired many Capellans to volunteer for military service, some must have been motivated by the fact that the army was well fed and cared for. Despite the lull in the fighting, there were a few flare-ups between February 3029 and the renewal of more widespread warfare by mid-May. The private war between Wolf's Dragoons and House Kurita accounted for most of these. The 5 elite mercenary regiments of the Dragoons had fought a death duel with their mirror-image Kurita unit, the Ryuken, at the conclusion of their contract with House Kurita, and after they signed on with the Federated Sons, the Fourth War broke out, and they fought the Draconis Combine for the rest of the war. Other than the Dragoon Kurita fighting during the lull, the only other important incident was a Capellan raid to steal Federated Sons' military secrets. A private war. After suffering 50% losses on Misery, the battered Wolf's Dragoons left Kurita space. They had precious little time to mend. Deployed on Glenmora, Harrow's Son, and Wapakoneta, the Dragoons were a major target of the Dragon's Wrath at the beginning of the Fourth War. And while not yet recovered from Misery, the Dragoons faced full-strength Kuritan forces. Even as relative quiet began to settle temporarily over the Inner Sphere, the Dragoons remained locked in continuing bloody struggles on all 3 garrison worlds.